we've kind of played around with this idea, and I know you have teased me amongst others of liking the certain unlikable pop culture shows. And so I thought we should do, it's not going to be this time, but we should do one where I just have to defend like the cringiest pop culture like stanzas. So I'm going to defend the final season of Game of Thrones. I'm going to defend the episodes 7 through 9 of Star Wars. I'm going to defend Matrix 2, 3, and 4. That's just going to be the entire...
And 4?
Yeah,
Four.
I haven't even seen 4 yet, to be honest.
Welcome to the Voyage podcast, a show that traverses the oceans of myth and legend through the lens of Catholic theology and philosophy. Come aboard as we set sail in pursuit of the heroic life and Christian virtue, with your hosts, Mike Schramm and Jacob Platty.
Thank you, everybody, for joining Jacob and I. For this episode of the Voyage podcast, we are going to be talking about The Matrix, but in not necessarily the same way, and we're not just going to be like dunking on the bad parts of it or anything like that. It's going to be mostly, what's sort of the appeal, right? Because it's becomes not just the movie itself a pop culture phenomenon, but even just if you've heard the phrase like red pilled, that's of course a reference to The Matrix too. And so, sorry, not Matrix number 2, Matrix as well.
Yes, there you go. Very nice.
But before we get into the conversation, just want to remind you guys, encourage you guys, like and subscribe the show, leave a positive review, because, well, it's kind of the one thing that is keeping Jacob from holding on to reality. He so desperately wants to like enter back into the Matrix and just eat that steak dinner. Like,
I want that steak.
What's his name? Yeah,
this is the middle of Lent. I want that steak.
Oh yeah. Oh man.
Hey, if you eat a steak, of course you weren't Catholic, but if you eat a Matrix steak in Lent,
are you breaking the fast?
Does it count as breaking the fast? Loophole.
Yeah. Ooh, yeah, interesting.
Okay. So, I'm suddenly much more friendly towards technology.
I was going to say, that's actually a perfect like, this isn't, I'm not eating the steak, my body's eating the steak. That's the perfect kind of soul body Cartesian dualism that
my mind is eating the steak.
We're not totally addressing, right? But it kind of flows into that. So yeah, Jacob, what if I told you that we're going to talk about The Matrix?
Pause.
Yeah, exactly. So
I would say the cat was out of the bag a couple minutes ago.
Which
or
again,
is that a Matrix reference?
No, I think you're talking about the White Rabbit. Is that the start of the Matrix?
No, I was referencing the Deja Vu cat.
Because sure.
There's that moment where they have the
knocking over the So and
no, I was referencing the Deja Vu cat.
What?
Because they have that, but all right. I was just trying to be meta there.
Yeah.
This is gonna be a very meta episode.
Let's try not to pat ourselves on the back too hard either. So that's the first thing actually and like I said, not that The Matrix will be the only example, because not only has it spawned other, you could say, derivatives or copycats, but even it's done like what you said. It's done that self-referential, like people have made the self-referentialness of The Matrix. They've self-referenced it. And so you can see, not only is there the M. Night Shyamalan twist, but there's the everything is a joke of the M. Night Shyamalan twist. Or,
Indeed.
Even I'm thinking of, did you ever, it was a Netflix, I think it's still going actually. So it's like an animated, kind of adult animated comedy called Inside Job, where it kind of makes fun of like all the different conspiracies. It's like basically every conspiracy that's ever been said is true.
Yeah, the cartoon.
And it's making fun of, yeah.
I've seen a handful of those episodes. I don't remember when I dropped off it, but I watched a few of them.
So the what if I told you, right? That classic scene where Morpheus, confronts Neo, and he basically starts that process of, having his eyes opened, right? Or having his third eye opened, or being red pilled.
And the mirror gets all gooey.
Yeah. Why is the quote, everything is not as it seems, kind of conspiracy theory or almost like trope? Why is that so appealing?
Well, I'm actually thinking about that question.
Take your time.
Why do people appeal? We got nothing to, Everyone just sit in silence for a while.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
That's good
audio.
podcasting right there. That's a pretty good question. I'm always
Because it's not even so
kind of
much like
intrigued
a.
by, well, people like Elon Musk think that we live in a program, right? I mean,
Mm,
maybe that's just like folklore or something like that, but I there's lots of intelligent people, and they tend to be the ones that are like kind of really intelligent, where they won't believe in God, let's say, but they'll believe that it's highly likely, highly probable that
yeah.
um we're actually in a matrix. Um
What
yeah, I
if
don't
we're in
know.
God's matrix? Yeah.
Whoa.
No, I think somebody.
Whoa.
Yeah, it's basically. Yeah, you still believe in God. The God you believe in is just a huge nerd or something. So
Yeah, it's pretty much
it's
just a
that's all the
giant
Matrix.
cosmic incel in his basement
So, but
playing
why? And stepping aside from the whether it's true or not, I mean, obviously, you would hope that sincerely we want to believe something because we believe it's true. But that's those are kind of two separate questions of like, why is it appealing? Why do we want the everything is not as it seems? Like I said, it could
you
be the
know,
conspiracy theory. It could be the big twist at the end, sort of thing. Um, or knowing the spoilers before somebody else does, or having that info. Why is that always? It doesn't
I'm
have to just be
honestly
pop
calling into
culture, but that's
question your
just
your premise here. I don't know if anyone wants this to be a matrix. I think that some people think that it's probable that it's a matrix because it's like a mathematical certainty, blah blah blah. But like Neo, he doesn't like to think that he's not in control of his own life.
well. That's
And
no, but
so,
that's what I'm saying is, I'm not trying to argue that people want it to be the exact premise of the Matrix. It's more we want there to be something behind the veil. We want there
mhm,
to be more than just what we see, and again, even though it's not a good thing that Neo, sees behind that or sees the reality behind the Matrix, it's good that he knows it. Do you see the difference?
yeah,
And
no, I
that's
think
that's
so.
the real because that's the real desire of the filmmaker or of the viewer. It's not that it's a good thing behind it necessarily, but you at least know the reality, as opposed to and I always forget the bad guy's name, who eats the steak, who betrays
Agent
the
Smith?
no, who betrays
Yeah, yeah,
the
who
group.
betrays it?
Joe
Um,
Pantoliano's he's the actor,
why
but
can't think of doesn't it start with a C?
Cipher.
Cypher. Yep, that's
Oh
what it
yeah, there
is.
you
It's
go.
Cypher. Yep.
So, but you can look at even from there are sort of Christian parallels to this, or there's and not just Christian but human parallels to this. Because what are these two things pointing to? Is we all have this temptation to Gnosticism or secret knowledge, which is basically
Mhm.
what the core group of the Matrix has, right? They're the ones who know how things really are, whereas the rest of you are just sheep, or the rest of you are just following your programming. Or there's this skepticism, which, like I said,
Mhm.
that's the whole idea that things aren't as they seem, whether it's a conspiracy theory, whether it's the premise of the Matrix movie, whether it's the premise of pretty much every spy movie, right? It's like, oh,
Yeah.
they have to have some twist about this spy was actually working for this organization, or this spy was a double agent, or whatever.
Right,
um
right.
so we have these two human temptations, or these human
So
tendencies towards
skepticism, and what was the other one?
Gnosticism.
Oh, yeah, like elitism, like a kind of hidden knowledge type.
Yeah.
I want to know. I want to be on the inside track, unlike all these other rubes.
Well, yeah, no, that's basically that's sort of like digging down. That's the foundation of, we could just maybe just refer to the
I
Matrix
mean, I
primarily,
might be
but
messing up your outline here, Mike, but or there's just the
oh
good old
no.
fashioned desire. Yeah, no,
Yeah.
or there's just the good old fashioned desire for the truth, right? Like that philosophical, perennial philosophical question: would you rather know the truth and be unhappy? And
Mhm.
there's any insert any given permutation of this, any given anecdote. My wife's cheating on me, but I have a happy marriage, or something like that. Would you
Sure.
rather know the truth and be unhappy, or be blissfully ignorant?
Was it
And our friend
was it
Cypher, he's enjoying that steak because he's like, the truth's for the birds, right?
yeah. And so he's operating on that almost like, I mean, I guess you'd say hedonism, sort of like, where it's like if it's convenient for me to, in his case, get the pleasure of the fake steak dinner, or whatever, because he's selling out his true friends or the people who truly helped him by giving him that true knowledge or knowledge about reality. But
There's
in the
something
same way that
very
I mean,
Well,
yeah, Gnosticism and skepticism, those are just distortions on, like you said, an authentic desire for the truth, right? In one,
sure,
it's
sure.
the truth that, you have at the expense of everybody else. The other is, well, you're still driving at that truth that everybody else can believe this thing, but I have I know how things really are with
You
the,
know, it's interesting because like I am familiar with this this classic critique of religion that is the opiate of the masses, right?
um,
In other words, the idea is that people don't want to know the truth. They would rather live in their sheltered kind of uh religious haze, right? And not
yeah.
face not face the ubermensch needing reality of just willing to make meaning out of nothingness type stuff, right? That
hmm
type of um that whole type of thing, right? But what
Well, and
strikes
sorry to
me
cut you up,
about
but
that.
even just the making meaning out of nothingness, it's like now you get to become the creator of the matrix, right? If you're making the meaning out of nothing, then you're just
Mhm.
making a rudimentary matrix.
Oh
I
yeah,
mean,
and then everyone's like their own god, right?
I mean
This
that's
it all just it's almost mundane.
well, no, that's just
How
yeah.
much everything goes back to just people wanting to be in control and playing God and
Well,
things
you
like
even
that.
alluded to the will to power thing, so it's like yeah, it's just
Yeah,
another
no,
version of
that's
the.
the only
I mean,
that's the only authentic. And so what's interesting about the example of Cypher and how he chooses to go back into his opiate of the Matrix type reality.
mhm,
People in the movie especially is saying, well, this guy is so evil and vile for doing that. Now obviously he's evil and vile for betraying his friends or whatever, but it seems to me that if you actually do believe that there is no inherent meaning to anything, then calling religion an opiate because it doesn't show people the truth is this kind of like baseless allegation.
mhm.
Because ultimately there is no significance to what's true or what's untrue. And so if happiness comes from delusion, then who cares? I mean,
Well,
this kind of goes into like Brave New World type stuff
oh yeah,
where,
that's kind of what made us want to have this conversation, as like our next because we were talking about Brave New World.
yeah, we were talking about this during the AI conversation, things like that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure we'll get into a lot like, this is kind of a hobby horse of mine, this whole conversation. But like like you in Brave New World, you look at a reality in which everyone's pleasure is given to them and the world is artificial, not in a matrix sense, but they've literally constrained all of the different variables in reality so that there's everything's accounted for, and then you have these outsiders who live on a reservation who can come and witness this artificiality of reality, this kind of
Oh, flip that. I think it's the
man-made.
people from the Brave New World can experience the savage life, where it's not manufactured
Well,
by
that's
soma and
true.
pleasure and all
No,
that
I
stuff.
know. I was just skipping to the point where one of the savages comes to back to civilization, quote unquote, though. You're right. I mean, like, so, the
Oh,
the people
when
in
John, yeah,
civilization can go and literally go visit just a like a zoo almost, right?
yeah.
And get their kicks. But no, I'm just skipping to the point where like a savage can come to civilization and view it and say, I don't want that. I want my pain. I want my suffering. I want
Well,
authenticity.
and it's interesting. The main character, the savage John, when he goes back to the civilized world,
Mhm.
and actually towards the end of the book, and the book's been out for like 100 years, so but
True.
he starts to actually he breaks away back into this not the savage world equivalent. He gets out of the city or gets away from the
Yeah.
soma and he starts to actually live an ascetical lifestyle where we have the self-flagellation, just like we see the people whether it's the desert hermits or the monks in the cloister, where he would start
Mhm.
to take on these ascetical practices. Now, what's interesting about that, and obviously Huxley would have been familiar with this growing up in a, at least historically Christian England, but,
Mhm.
and just being well read and all that stuff. But in for his character, where would that have come from? You almost get the sense that it came naturally. Like he had to have some sort of penance, some sort of penitential practice. And that's the penitential practice, that's what it looks like for him.
No,
And
that's
he's breaking
interesting.
away from like you said, this sort of hedonistic, like drug or soma fueled urban lifestyle.
Well, Huxley, he always had this kind of interesting, like, respect or fascination. I mean, I'm not an expert on Huxley, but I have read Brave New World, and I have read, what was his book about?
Was it Brave New World Revisited? Because that's
No,
the kind of
it was his essay. It's basically an extended essay on the use of hallucinogens in
okay.
ritual and things like that. It's famous. Um, oh man, this is famous. It's a famous book, and the name's not coming to me. Anyway, I've read both of those, right? So that's where I'm coming from here. And he seems to have he acknowledges the vital importance of spirituality and religion.
Yeah.
Though he himself, I don't think he was a practitioner, right?
No, he
Again,
kind of gives like
I'm not really
backhanded
an expert on it.
compliments to the spirit, like you said, the more spirituality elements, but definitely not. He was critical of like the organized religion
hmm
aspect to it.
well, what I wanted to get to with the whole Huxley thing, though, was this was back when I was talking about, there's this critique of religion that's an opiate and blah blah. People aren't brave enough to face reality, kind of thing. But if reality doesn't actually have any meaning anyway, then there's no inherent virtue to facing it, right? And
Mhm.
in fact, so far as I can tell, it ultimately just leads to more. Like, in other words, we can face it. It just beats us down as cultures. It beats
And
us down as
how
societies.
do you even
Well, and
know that you're facing it? I
this
mean,
is what the world's builder guy, Mon, what's his name? Mondu,
Mustafa Mond.
yeah, Mond. There you go. It's basically what he critiques. John the Savage with when they're having their big climactic conversation towards the end of the
Mhm.
book, where John's like, "No, I want my pain, I want my suffering, and things like that." And Mustafa Mond is like, only only because you think you do. But
Yeah.
obviously, what I've created here is a much better idea than whatever your nostalgia is for pain and suffering and things like that. That's just delusion, right? So he
Yeah.
basically says, I would rather have this deluded society that's nothing but just like drug soaked, sex soaked hedonism.
Mhm.
Um, because that's preferable to your supposed, willing through the pain and the suffering kind of thing. And I'm not sure there's like a great critique of that unless you actually believe in transcendent realities that you're beholden to.
Well, that's just
If
it
you
is
don't have
like
those, then the truth doesn't matter. If you
even if
don't have those, it
even
really
if John
doesn't
is
matter.
right, you don't ultimately want it. And even John doesn't want it because if you remember, the end of the book, I mean, he
Well,
in a
yeah.
sense escapes it too, or he chooses to escape it as well. I couldn't help but so you're grasping at the name Mustafa Mond. So if you break like the word Mustafa is chosen and then Mond like mundo or it's
Mundo,
world,
yeah,
chosen
Latin
world.
for world, right?
So you got chosen world right in the character, which I mean, obviously is clever. Like every author is going to do. They're going to give that sort of wink to this to the ethos of the person, right?
Did you know that Neo means new?
Hey,
It's also an anagram for one. Whoa.
ah,
Oh, wait, no, let me redo that. Whoa.
yeah. Oh gosh.
Uh,
Uh, so
all
so we
right.
get this not only in media, right? We've mentioned the Matrix. The M Night Shyamalan is just known for the twist or whatever. Um, but then even like coming up in social media, we see the same desire when people have talked about the concept of fake news and how like it's speaking to this same Gnosticism, right? Where it's like, oh, that's the story or that's the idea that's presented to you, but I know the real story, right?
hmm
I know I can see behind the curtain. Um, or and I've already mentioned the red pilled thing, but like even just the existence of filters on social media, right?
Yeah. Well, let me get into why I'm such a Luddite. Because I really am. It's ironic because I work with technology all the time. But I don't trust it, as we learned in the
Mm,
AI episode. And I certainly don't trust it when it comes to this conversation because where I would go with this conversation when it comes to uh, questions of epistemology, how do we know what we know, right?
yeah.
And reality and how this applies to the matrix and technologies. I think that we're already baking in all of that stuff. We're building it. And to reference another classic dystopian novel, the Fahrenheit 451 book by Ray
Mhm.
Bradbury. I think a couple episodes back or an episode ago, I can't remember when we were talking about this, but I revisited that and discovered that the pop culture, kind of meme about that book is that it's about censorship. It's about, the government coming in and burning books. But the real, what the book actually talks about is how society rejects
Yeah.
knowledge. Society rejects ideas and learning because it's easier to go into a Brave New World type reality where you just zone out in the TV, right? And
Yeah,
that it's not a top down thing at all. It's a
it
completely
didn't need to
bottom
be.
up choice, right?
And
It's
that's
just it's
closer to the
the
Brave New World example,
population.
like you were saying.
Well, and it's very much where we are in reality right now,
Mhm.
right? I have to very, very much have these very explicit conversations with my kids about why it's important to read old stuff,
Yeah.
like why it's important to watch old movies. Because if you don't, you think that all reality is the last 5 minutes.
Well,
And I'm telling you, the last 20 years, the world that my children have grown up in is not the world I grew up in.
no, it's
And they
changed
will
way
never,
faster.
and they won't ever be able to experience what life was the way that I experienced it when I was a kid. It's
Well,
impossible to give that to
and to
them.
your point, actually, I want to go back to the Fahrenheit 451 thing because one of the things that really drives your point home about it's not mostly about censorship, it's mostly about the replacement of wisdom with technology. Is
Mhm.
what is what do we find at the end of that book? The good guys are the ones who, because every book has been destroyed, they've taken to memorizing the great works
Yeah.
of wisdom. And so the solution and it wasn't even that they wanted to burn the books either. This was just the reality they were faced with is they
Yeah.
had to use, they
They had
had
to
to
hide it in themselves.
that was the
They had to
only way to pass it down. And that goes back to, we had a conversation about myth and memory, right? And how there's
Yeah.
a story and you can find it in Plato's dialogues where um, even the writing down, the technology of writing something down was originally
Yeah.
rejected because it was taking away something that is innate to us. It's taking away that tool of memory and how that forms us.
I
It's
don't
not even just
know
the story itself does, but that the tool, the way to pass it down is a part of us.
I don't know if this is a myth or not, but I've been told that television sets were invented 20 years before they went to market, but the people who were trying to peddle them couldn't find they couldn't find an investor basically to actually mass produce them
Mhm.
because everyone was super skeptical that anyone would just sit on a couch and watch a TV set.
Hmm.
Because they're like, we have the radio, you can do stuff while you're
Yeah.
listening to our radio. Why would you just sit in a chair and just like look at something when
Oof.
you could just be doing stuff while listening to it? I don't know
That
if that's a true story or not, but it
that
very
aged that
much.
that story aged like milk, I think.
No, it's fascinating to.
It's
This goes
almost
back
like
to.
it's true in a deeper way than did it actually happen.
Yeah,
You know
no,
what I
it's like
mean?
chopping down the cherry tree, right?
Yeah,
Like it says something about previous
it's
cultures.
truer than
Um,
history almost.
right,
Like you said,
right.
you don't know if it's a myth. Hey, if it's a myth, it's true in a different way. So,
Yeah, no, it's apropos. It still comes up in conversations like this. The idea that if we don't pay attention to what the world was like prior to our current moments, that we're going to be very foolish, that we're going to, and we can be manipulated, right? Now this is true of both Fahrenheit 451 and Brave New World, where you can well, even 1984, the big three, 1984 is all about controlling information and things like that, right? And that one's much more explicit. That one's much more the archetypal example of a big brother.
yeah, top
Obviously
down
big
like you
brother
were
comes
saying.
from it top down, manipulation of people's media intake so that it can be controlled. But, if you can convince people to buy into what you want, and honestly, even in 1984, because most of that book's talking about this kind of upper class of people
Yeah.
who are in the know, but the majority of people are just like the blue collar types that just don't care one way or the other. The
Or
majority of
or
people in
driven to it by fear,
1984.
right? Like fear has kind of been
Well, that's true. I would actually argue. I mean, like, so the party members, like the upper class, those people, like the lower levels of the party, are driven by fear, right? The
Mhm.
the antagonist, or I mean, the protagonist of that book is an example of this, right?
Yeah.
Where he's afraid to do anything, kind of thing. But if I'm not mistaken, like 90% of the population is more akin to the Fahrenheit 451 types, where
Mhm.
they're just uneducated kind of brutes who just like play darts in the pub and
Mhm.
just drink beer, and they don't care about politics, they don't care about what's happening, they don't care about what's being, it's absolute apathy,
Who's at
right?
war with who again? Yeah, it doesn't.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they don't care. And so, like, again, how much so basically we're at the nexus of all three of these novels right
Mhm.
now, and it's all driven by this matrix type
I was
technology
gonna say
that
you
we
can
call
see
social media.
parallels to the Matrix in all three of them in interesting ways. But sorry, keep going.
Mhm. No, that's cool. And so it starts out so slow, and I'm a product of this too, right? I mean, I'm under 40, right? I was born in 85. So it's not like I was, born forever ago. It's just that I was at the turning point. I was at this liminal place in history where I remember the internet becoming a thing. I remember it being introduced into schools and things like that. Um, and I've
Oof.
just seen it. Yeah, no, that's true. And it's weird because I'm not that old, but I feel
Just keep saying
really
it.
old.
Just keep saying it. You'll make it true. That's part of what
Yeah,
we're talking about, right?
that's
That's
what we're
the
talking about.
yeah.
This is the real theme of today's
Just
conversation,
manifest it.
kids.
Manifest that
Is
you
that your
know.
Uncle Jacob isn't that old.
You only
But
have your kids to remind you of that. I have like 100 kids every day to remind me of how old I am, and I'm younger than you.
I know. I tell you what, and honestly, what's scary about it is how much they feel that's true, right?
Mm.
But there's this concept called liquid modernity, right? And I forget who coined it, but liquid modernity is this idea that there's no stability anymore, no cultural stability, no cultural memory,
Mm.
because everything is just a product of the moment. And this is driven by the technology that's overtaken our lives. It's driven by the idea that we live in hyper reality at all times now. Hyper reality is this deconstructionist concept. It's I'm mixing up my movements, philosophical movements from the 20th century. Post-structuralism, right? All right,
Mm.
so basically hyperreality is introduced as this concept where
It's
in the
not on the
example that was
outline, so
given.
I can't.
Haha. So back in the 50s when Disneyland was first being developed and things like that, that was the big example given of what these authors were trying to describe as hyperreality, where you have the like Main Street USA, like the main thoroughfare of Disneyland, and it is this recreation of everyone's ideal of what's like Americana looks like. And it's like the mom and pop shops, it's Mayberry, it's and what the authors described this as was hyper reality. It looks like reality, but it is actually this fashioned reality that is meant to invoke the warm fuzzies within us.
It's a
It's
caricature.
catered. It's a caricature. It's hyper real.
It
It's
kind of
more
reminds me
real than
of it's
real.
like the
It's
scene, the woman in the red dress in the Matrix, right? It's almost like it was
yeah,
created,
absolutely.
right? It's supposed to be, and again, this obviously has a lot of other facets that somebody could talk about, but it's almost like the computer created the caricature of the male gaze and had it walk
Hmm.
by Neo in that scene.
Yeah,
You know?
and of course, of course, it works, right? Just like Main Street USA absolutely pulls on the heartstrings. It's like smelling cookies. Like you can't help but be beholden to it. It's a passion in the classical Christian sense. That's why it's interesting. I think that the
Well, and
church
the
fathers
word
actually speak
passion
out against.
is passive. You're passive to it, so that's why we
You're
get it.
Yeah, you
So
are
it's
controlled by it. You get
yeah.
pushed by it. You're pushed by it. Yeah. Um, the but they speak out against nostalgia.
Mhm.
That's right. The church, the history of the church, the wise teachers of the church teach us to avoid nostalgia.
I remember when they talked about nostalgia. It was better back then. Oh,
That's
boo.
very,
Yeah.
there
Where's
you
the boo
go.
sound effect?
Yeah. But so you look at something like Stranger Things, right? A show
Mm.
that I've legitimately enjoyed. I mean, I think that its quality is kind of waning a little bit, but it's it's all about going back to this period of time and creating a hyper reality out of
Yeah.
the 80s, right? It's creating this caricature of the 80s, this
80s on
icon,
steroids. Yeah.
this 80s iconography almost,
Mm.
which is just such a natural thing for humans to do.
It's
And
like they
honestly,
took a show and they put the 80s filter on, right? To use the kind of social
absolutely.
media, like, oh, this is the, again, caricature, or let's just put down the 80s filter so this thing always pops up whenever, the kids show up, they have to wear this t-shirt because that was a
Mhm.
thing or whatever.
Well, and so we're using examples like this because what I want to do anyway is point out that we are living this in real time via our social media apparatus. In other words, like hyperreality, we can point to examples of hyperreality and say, oh, look, there's hyperreality over there. And you can't see me, but I'm pointing with my hand here. There's hyperreality over there at Disneyland. And there's hyperreality over there in Stranger Things. And there's
Mhm.
hyperreality over there. And I'm pointing to all these places like outside of me as if it's like somewhere else, but I'm still in reality. And you know what? I don't think that's true anymore. I think that we are officially in
Well, it's like
hyperreality.
you're living in a Jacob matrix where everything that is being presented to you is through this, like you said, hyper reality, according to you, right? Or it's a projection of yourself.
Well, because we have so much control. All right, so let me give you an example. My poor kids, they're the ones that I always get to kind of drag through the mud here, basically. But it's all right. They'll never listen to this anyway. So,
Yeah. What's a podcast?
yeah. But so much of their friending takes place over headphones on their video games that they play. And
Mm.
the activities that they find the most joy from, the most fulfillment from, are digital landscapes that they engage with and perform these gamified fetch quests, or achievement, type things, or ranking systems within these various video games that they play. And they're having legitimate friendship building moments in the achievement of these activities, but
Mhm.
they're completely divorced from the physical plane, right?
Well, and
But
the
that's like,
only semblance of like the body's participation is what chemicals were released in the brain when the eyes saw that thing on the screen, you know?
right. And you know, so that's just how they do their kind of like friend time. Now they will have friends over, and we actually encourage, like, we go out of our way to encourage having friends come over because we really believe in them, getting out of the house and having doing things in real life together and things like that. But the weight of their reality is still vested in either what they're doing over video games or what they're doing over social media, right? Where they're engaging with people's performed lives, these hyper realities that we present to each other over the internet, basically. Um, that it's not rooted in smells and noises and physical appearances that are actually what people look like and things like that. But it's so normalized in people's minds that now we're getting back into basically the Brave New Worlds analogy where the soma technology is soma now, and people, they don't desire anything outside of technology. They
Mhm.
don't realize that they're missing it because it's not being missed at all. And if you try to explain, no, it's fun to go out and walk in the woods for an hour, you might as well be John the Savage saying that he
Mhm.
wants his pain, right?
Oh, yeah.
Um,
The pain of
and
the lack of, overstimulated sensation, right?
mhm,
And it actually reminds me of, do you remember you mentioned Fahrenheit 451? Montag, the main character, his wife, I remember when we read it in high school too, but the teacher was like, yeah, they have earbuds before earbuds were ever a concept. They called them seashells, I think it was, and how
mm.
you'd put them in, that's how
Or
you
you're
would
mixing it
get,
up with Demolition Man, and that's somehow how they clean themselves after going poo.
I I don't think that's. I'm pretty sure it was fair enough, but also it wasn't just that you would sit in front of one screen, but that you'd go into a room and it was an immersive like 4 screen or 3 screen
Yeah,
kind of
yeah,
experience,
yeah.
which is
In Fahrenheit
basically
451, you're
that's
in
the
a, yeah.
VR that we are That it's
Well,
just
honestly, or
rudimentary
it's
VR.
just having TV. You know, when Fahrenheit 451 was written, it's not like we had big screen TVs, right?
Mhm.
People still had. So the idea that they had these giant wall-sized monitors, and you know, I have a projector in my home, so I literally do watch things the size of a wall. You know, it's like
But
I
the
am
immersiveness
Fahrenheit
too,
451.
that you're
Yeah.
immersed now. It's not just one wall or one screen, it's the whole room.
Mm-hmm.
And that's
Well,
the
and to use your VR analogy, you know, like to go back to it. Well, yeah, I mean, and now you're starting to get like very matrixy, right? But
Mhm.
then where this is really going to go is when we start to like integrate ourselves with technology and things like that, and this kind of this idea that uh, we're going to start to incorporate technology into our minds and things like that, and kind of interface with technology like through our biology and things like that. I'm not some kind of guy who knows a bunch about that. I just understand that technology has to go somewhere. And so the idea that technology is going to move us towards, like
like
right now we have
plugging into
Apple
the back of your
Watches.
neck where your brainstem is,
Yeah,
right?
no,
Like,
exactly, right? It sounds far-fetched and science fiction-y, but right now we have Apple Watches and they're monitoring your heart rate and they're, you know, monitoring your your perspiration and you know, like they're engaging with you and they're telling you when your appointments are and you're getting your social media messaging from them like Dick Tracy. And it's how convenient
Dick
would it be
Tracy.
if that was yeah, that's right. That's a reference I just threw out there. But the
So old.
how anyone yeah, I mean, come on. They're it's Dick Tracy. It's straight out Dick Tracy. But you know, how convenient would that be if you didn't have to like strap it on? What if it was just already in your, you know, body somehow, you know, kind of thing? And then you have examples of people actually getting microchips put into their hands so they can like walk through grocery stores and just get like scanned through their palm.
Hmm.
That's actually being evidently I sound like a nut when I say these things, but evidently that's already being tested out where you
And
actually just have an
the point of this
embedded
isn't to be a technology podcast where we get the news. Like, we're very much downstream. This is not us breaking any sort of news. This is us commenting on or tying it into pop culture, right? And but then also tying it into these bigger, like you said, transcendent, right? Right at the beginning of our
Mhm.
conversation is how do these tie into the transcendent? Or to better yet, how do you tie into the transcendent, right?
Well, you know, and let me go where I want to go, which is to say what I've realized when it comes to all this technology, because this is all basically learned in real time within the last like 20 years of my life, right? I didn't grow up anti-technology. I would very much in favor of the internet, very much in you know in favor of all of it. Like I was not a football player. I was a nerdy kid who enjoyed, you know, the internet and enjoyed reading books and playing video games and things like that, right? But what I've witnessed across time and as I've engaged with the younger generation that's growing up is what's happening is all of this plugged inness to hyper reality is making people unable to engage with reality well and they can't escape
Incarnational
reality.
reality, right?
Incarnational reality, right?
Yeah.
And what I you know, we just barely referenced what's called the NOUS on the last
Yeah.
episode of this podcast in the last like couple minutes because that's when you talk about the NOUS.
Well,
Well,
and
now
that's
that
what
we
made you want to
have
do this one next. And I was like, well, he's trying
yeah.
to participate. I'll let him, follow up and do his idea. So I was like, I'll throw him this bone.
So what the noose is, and it's kind of a slippery concept. It took me a while to find anyone who could just give me like a straight answer about it
Yeah.
that I could understand anyway. But since then, I've found some pretty easy little heuristics for it. But fundamentally, what the noose is your part of your soul that is aware of God. Ultimately, the part of your soul that's aware of
Or
God,
just
but
transcendence. But yeah.
or any type of numinous reality, right? If you want to bring it down to earth, it's the part of your soul that admires a beautiful sunset, let's say, and then
Well,
is
and
able
even
to
just the
recognize that
concept
beautiful
of beauty
sunset
itself, right? The
and
universal of.
realize that it's pointing to something, right?
Mm.
Yeah. It's that old caricature of like there's an American Dad episode where Stan discovers that his best friend is an atheist, right? And so the rest of the episode is Stan trying to convince his atheist buddy of God's existence. And it's a fascinating example of watching atheist screenwriters try to imitate Christian apologists.
Oh boy.
And just like the caricatures that they give for Christian apologetics, right?
Yeah.
But one of the things that Stan does is take his buddy out to a sunset, and he says, "Look, it's beautiful. It's how can you say that God doesn't exist when you see all this beauty?" And was that a pretty good impression
Yeah,
of
no,
Stan?
it's been a while since I've seen the show.
Yeah.
It took me right back.
Yeah, there you go. And his friend's like, "Yeah, it is beautiful. It doesn't mean that God exists, right?" It's like, "Yeah, of course." But what
Mhm.
Stan's getting at, he's talking about the nous in that moment. And it's like, why don't you see what I see? It's because there's actually this organ within the soul, this mechanism within the soul, this ability within the soul that could be clouded. It's the eye of the soul. This is what Jesus is talking about when he says, if the eye of the soul is darkness, then how great is that darkness?
Mhm.
Or how did I mix up those words? The lights, the eye, the lights,
I kind of am.
eye is the light of
Yeah, I'm kind
Okay.
of thinking
Well,
of your
anyway,
reference.
you guys know what
Yeah.
I'm talking about. Go look it up. But
You didn't even give a citation, so
it's in there, kids. Just read all of it.
yeah.
See, now I'm stuck on it. It's the eye and the light and the
Well,
darkness.
it's
Anyway,
the
anyway,
it's the scene, like you said, beyond just what's there, right? This goes back to our whole Matrix thing
the
of like,
ability to see,
it's
to be able to
not just seeing
notice
that one
transcendent
sunset.
realities.
It's seeing the concept of beauty or the transcendental of beauty behind this one example of beauty.
And the intuition that it points to something true and transcendent, right? It being able to see it, you can't unsee it. Now, if you're nous, if you're eye of the soul, if you're noticing faculty, because that's the thing, the opposite, like a clear nous sees God in everything, right?
Mhm.
And notices God in, like, it's not like you have to turn it on. It's like when Neo finally sees the Matrix for what it is, and it's all green digits and all that stuff. That's him becoming this purified, enlightened state, more or less, within the analogy of the Matrix. And suddenly he sees reality for what it truly is. And in this analogy, his nous has been cleansed. He's tapped into and purified his nous to the extent that he sees reality in its nakedness. For
Well,
the Christian, that would be seeing God,
so
like being hyper aware of his reality
and this kind of takes me
everywhere.
back to, so I said it as a joke, but the title of this is "What If We're in God's Matrix?" And that kind of touches on what you were talking about first with the sunset example, but now with Neo seeing, in his case, it's the code of the computer behind the images that are being projected. But
Mm-hmm.
this actually points to it's one of Aquinas's 5 ways for God's one. It's called standards of being or gradations of being, where just go back to the sunset thing. That is one example of beauty. Now, we all recognize that it's an example of beauty because it participates on this standard of beauty. And the sunset is really, really high on the standard, whereas something that, is ugly or whatever is really low on the standard. But every example, every individual thing is just one example on the standard. It's not the standard itself. And yet, all of those examples rely upon a standard of beauty for them to participate. The sunset might
Sure.
participate on a very high level, we'll say 90% or whatever of the standard of beauty. Whereas, and I don't want to come up with an example because I don't want to be mean, but something will be very low on the standard.
Sure.
Because it doesn't participate in beauty itself to the same degree, right? Degrees of being. But
Yep.
all of those things rely on the concept of beauty itself or the reality of beauty itself. Well, what if you took that same idea and didn't just apply it to beauty, didn't just apply it to moral goodness, didn't just apply it to power, but applied it to existence? So now, everything that is quote unquote real, everything that exists, it's real to the degree that it participates on this standard. And so something that is, we'll just say like, we'll just use the color red, right? You can have 100% red, or you can have 90% red mixed with a little bit of white, and then it's not as red anymore.
That's called a tint. I'm a graphic designer.
Yeah.
Okay. Go on.
So it is not participating on the standard of redness to the same degree that 100% red is, but it still has redness there, but it relies upon You could
You
say
have to know what
color
red
itself.
is in
Yeah.
order for
There
you to
has to
be able to
be this
gauge how red it
pre-existing.
is. Right.
So in the same way, right, you can say a fully developed person or a fully developed, acorn, which grows into a tree, participates more on that standard than a seed that doesn't sprout or a seed that, gets eaten up by the birds or whatever, to quote a
Mhm.
different metaphor. Um, and so that also implies, right, this standard of existence itself, which in the classical theistic, classical Christian understanding, that's what Christians mean when they talk about God. They don't
Well,
just mean beautiful sunset equals God exists. There's a big middle area, right? There's a what's it called? Undistributed middle term that Sam, because he's not a philosopher or whatever, he left out.
sure. Well, and it's that trying to convey that awareness that cannot be made unaware again, right? So much of all of this about epistemology and about what the Matrix is as a parable goes back to like Plato's cave, right? Plato's
Uh-huh.
cave is the example that was given in history, and all of
Platonic
these things are
realism.
just different,
Yeah.
just versions of it. But basically, everyone's stuck in a cave, and there's shadow puppets on the wall. Like here's a tree, and here's a dog, and there's a pineapple, and everyone's chained to a wall, so they can't see where the puppets are. They just see the shadows. And they've been that way since birth. Think about being in a matrix inside the little goo pods, and they don't know any difference. And then somebody shows up who has escaped from the chains and has been able to crawl their way out of the cave, and it hurt. It hurt. All that blinding
To
sunlight
see the
hurt.
sunlight, yeah.
But when they finally got out of the cave, they could see what a real tree is and what a real pineapple is and what a real dog looks like. And then they go
The
and they want to
forms
bring
on
that
which those
wisdom.
shadows are based. Yeah.
Exactly. Very
And
Platonic.
and what happens is that person goes back, and how do the people treat that prophet or that philosopher
They call him
when
crazy. He's a
yeah.
lunatic. What are you talking about?
I
You're
thought
just
they
making
killed him
stuff
too.
up,
Yeah, he's a martyr too,
Right.
right? Martyr for
C.S.
the
Lewis.
truth,
Oh,
like
that's probably
Socrates.
true. Yeah,
Well,
that's probably
wasn't it
true.
supposed to be an allegory sort of for Socrates too? Socrates tried to
Yeah,
tell the people
absolutely.
of Athens, and they killed him.
Right. Well, and C.S. Lewis does a really good job with this, which I think that he pulled it from other sources, right?
Well, he was
But
very Platonic compared to Aristotelian. But
mm-hmm.
yeah, anyway,
Well,
sorry. Go
so
ahead.
he's into Flatlanders, right? So he uses the Flatlanders, which it was an earlier novel that he was pulling the analogy from. But I think he's talking about it. He talks about it in a few different places. One of his a favorite essay of
Well,
mine is transposition, and that's he talks about it in transposition. But he also talks about it in regarding to the Trinity. Anyway, it's this idea that two-dimensional beings could never understand what a third dimension is, and if a
mhm.
third dimensional being could go into the 2D plane and point at a triangle, and if you remember your perspective drawing classes from middle school, a triangle is just a path that recedes into the distance, right? But technically, it's just a triangle in 2 dimensions. And trying to explain what a path going into the distance is to somebody who only sees a triangle, and the reality is they're technically it is a triangle. It is a triangle, and so they're
Mm.
not wrong when they only see the triangle, but they don't
It's
have
not enough.
the clear
Yeah.
nous to see the depth.
Well, and to
And
go back to your
so,
example in the cave, the shadows all resemble the reality. They all resemble the form,
mhm,
but they're
they're
still just
shaped like
shadows.
it,
Yeah.
right?
They're just not the full
Um,
reality. Just like, the people that Neo sees in the Matrix when he's still in the Matrix do look like or similar to the people when he's in the quote unquote real world, right? When he's pulled out of
mhm,
it. So
yep,
again, the shadows in reality are supposed to resemble each other. That's what makes them convincing.
yep. Well, and so here's what's happening in mass is that people like we already struggled with our news. We've always struggled. Sin corrupts the news. It makes it murky so that you're not aware of God. Anytime you ever feel like God's not there, which is a very common feeling even for Christians, even for saints, right? Like this is not doesn't make you a bad person, but basically the lack of feeling the presence of God is well there's actually probably many different explanations for it, but for a lot of people, for maybe the majority of people, it's a byproduct of our clouded nous, of our sullied souls, of our inability to have, been cleansed and purified from the muck that covers our eyes, the eye of the soul, and things like that.
Mm.
Um, what technology is doing is solidifying that. In other words, I worry that the hyper reality that we live in through social media and through technology is actually making it like Brave New World, where everyone doesn't even know to look for deeper things because they don't need to. They don't
Mhm.
feel like it.
It could
And
be
so
you
much
could
about
say it's not a chemical veil like soma is, it's more of a,
it's a
whatever.
technological veil. It's a
Yeah.
technology is the new drug par excellence, right?
Mm.
And if you go listen to some of those Lord of Spirits podcasts that I occasionally drop that talk about the Nephilim coming down and giving technology to the humans, right? In the first 11 chapters of Genesis, where all of that story is about and even the Garden of Eden, the knowledge of good and evil
Yeah.
is about being given, let's just call it technology, because techne, that Greek word that we get technology from, it just means A, it's a form of magic, and B, it's about just manipulating reality to suit your purposes,
Well,
right?
and that goes back to the
Um,
thing we said earlier in our conversation of you're just building your own matrix now. You're not participating in somebody else's, which some might even see as like a as better because now you get
yeah.
to your power of will is imposed upon it, right? On yourself, you could say, because you're
Mm-hmm.
building your own matrix. Now, it's just as unreal as if
Yep.
somebody else was doing it, but that's what makes it all the more tempting is, oh, well, now I
Well,
get
no, and
to
that's what
create
people
my
it's
own.
when people talk about my lived truth and your lived truth and everyone's lived truth, everyone has their own truth kind of thing, that's people acknowledging or giving into this idea that there's not an objective truth, and that's okay. In fact, it's better for us to understand that there's no such thing as objective truth, and it's important for us to just live in our own realities and respect our own
Because the
realities.
will
And
overpowers reality.
right, yeah.
Yeah.
It's so we've adopted, to go back to the opiate of the Matrix, the opiate of the this critique that religion has always just kept people from embracing like what reality actually is. Well, we've gone that happened. People
Mhm.
rejected religion and then they went back to rejecting reality anyway,
Yeah.
right? We no longer have this a solid concrete foundation. Everything's a house of sand now. And people don't want it otherwise because they don't know any different.
Well,
They're
and
so
again,
plugged in
that
that
plays
they
off of the idea that and again, not that every single Christian means this when he or she talks about God, but the concept of God is not built upon this thing external to reality, but the ground of reality, the ground of being. And so
Yep.
by go back to your example of rejecting religion or rejecting God, it becomes a rejection of reality. It's not alongside it, it's because of it,
Mm-hmm.
you know?
Yep. True, true.
So you've actually hit upon some of so I have the epistemological theories that I wanted to kind of check off the list. You mentioned Platonic realism. You started to get into nominalism and idealism, which was nice, without
Mm-hmm.
even, um,
That's what I do, Mike.
yeah.
That's what I do.
Do you remember well, and we've already talked about skepticism, of course, too. Uh, what's the sort of, I guess, epistemological way forward, if that makes any sense, in like the last 5 minutes, of course. Uh,
Honestly, I would argue that it has to be faith, right? This is where I
uh,
came to in my own personal journey, right? Because I'm a guy who likes to read and think and do things, and that can be a dangerous activity, can it not?
oh,
Read, that's what Ray Bradbury told us. But you start to, if you feel the absence of God, and you're engaging with all these different ideas and debates and things like that. So I had a little crisis of faith in my early 30s, where it's like, is any of it real? How do I know it's real? Blah blah blah. And ultimately it was the oh, who's the dude from the 18th century, Fear and Trembling. um he's a big philosopher guy. He starts the key,
oh,
Kierkegaard.
Kierkegaard, Søren
Kierkegaard. Yeah,
Kierkegaard.
yeah, there you
Okay,
go. Yeah, yeah. That kind of like leap of faith that he talks about,
okay,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Now, I mean, people find this to be a a pathetic attempt to just, this goes back to that critique of it being like just an opiate. Like, oh, well, you're just refusing to, face reality kind of thing. For my money, it became kind of obvious that if that's true, then giving yourself over to a belief that improves upon reality, that puts all the pieces together, that comes across as elegance and self-justifying and intuitive and actually results in an improved way of life and an improved idea is not a that's not a what's what I'm looking for. I'm not backing away from
Well,
reality.
no.
I'm just
It's the reality that can cohere with not just this beautiful sunset or that beautiful sunset, but the beauty behind every sunset, right?
mhm.
Is that the transcendent beauty, concept of beauty behind every individual beautiful thing. And so it's not so much when, you can call it a leap of faith in the sense of, because usually when people think of that, they think of like you're throwing away your ability to control or your ability to rationally think about it, right?
Mhm.
Because you're in the air, right? You're out of control, so to speak. But you've made the choice to jump, and that was, hopefully a rational decision, and that's where the reason kind of leads up.
Well, and it was because it's not a question. This is not an advocacy for just believing any willy-nilly nonsense, right?
Mhm.
The Christian tradition has 2,000 years of commentary on lots of things that you can basically get the answer to anything from, right? What was driving my crisis of faith was a feeling. It was a clouded noose. It was a sense about reality. It wasn't a logical argument, right? And so much of what drives people's lack of faith today it's not about the argument at all. There's plenty of fantastic arguments for everything that Christians believe. It's about that sense, it's about that clouded noose. It's about not being able to intuit God because we're building a world, a matrix, a hyper reality around us that
Mhm.
is leaving God out of it, right? We are creating a bubble, a godless bubble, and people don't realize God's missing, let alone that they want God in their lives. And I realized that I was just becoming absorbed into that matrix and
Yeah, I
that I
mean,
could participate in. So my participation in reality was truer when I chose to believe in God than it was when I was just going with the flow of society, because the
yeah,
flow of society is
it's
anti-God.
a
It's
deeper
anti-Christ.
it's a deeper
And I was
participation
just
in
swimming in it.
the
I
ground
was
of
just being
being.
pushed down the river. I wasn't I wasn't making choices for myself,
Mhm.
right? I was just going with the flow.
Oh,
And so that's what I realized. And so that's a little bit about my backstory there, but
so we almost, I mean, we're kind of at our ending-ish point that I really wanted to get into what you're bringing us right up to the brink of this relatively recent philosophical system called phenomenology, which has its own sort of, it's really a great synthesis of this objective and subjective, where, like you were saying, there's this objective reality that we participate in, but to the degree that we choose to participate in it, right? You make that jump or make that leap, that's where phenomenology kind of lives. That's what this philosophical system
yeah,
is.
well, and that drives
And
a lot of that whole Peterson moment, right? Where everyone was kind of blown away by what he was talking about, which I'll have you know came after my crisis of faith. It was almost like, being rewarded for my,
yeah,
return to Jesus or something like
you're
that.
like,
But
oh,
suddenly you
he
have
beat
all
me to
these
all
public
these
comment.
things. Yeah. He beat
No,
me to
no, no.
saying all this
I was
stuff.
happy for. I was happy for it because it was like it was this affirmation that,
I'd feel jealous.
you know.
Yeah. So,
um,
I don't. We're not going to follow this up with a part two next time, but I think this is definitely something I want to revisit because, like you
yeah,
said,
we'll
we're
thread the
only
themes.
going.
The themes
Yeah,
are,
we're only in
they'll
terms of
thread
like
through lots of stuff.
reflecting reality. Like we're only going in this direction further. So I think it deserves revisiting. And like I said, maybe diving a little bit deeper into the phenomenological aspect of it as well. So we'd obviously give some background into that and see how that sort of applies. Bring back some of our old examples, but yeah, no, this was really good. Thanks, Jacob, for the fun and enlightening conversation. It's always fun to get to revisit revisit the Matrix, the one Matrix.
Mhm.
I don't know about those other movies as much. But,
Go watch number 4. Dude,
yeah.
let's you have to watch number 4 and we have to talk about it. Matrix 4 is one of the weirdest movies I've ever seen, full stop. And I would say for the first like 60% of it, I was blown away at like this is the most meta commentary movie I've ever seen. Like we should have a whole conversation on Matrix 4 because the first 60%, then they totally betray that. They just it turns into nothing that I thought they were trying to do.
So it's a self-referential that then decides
It's the
how dumb being
most
self-referential
it's
is.
the
Is that
most
the,
it is and it's so self-deprecating for the first. It's like a movie
Okay.
that's attacking its own franchise for the first 60% of it.
Mm.
And it's like, you know what? Golf clap. Like I've never seen people just own themselves so like self-intentionally evidently, right? I assumed it was
Yeah.
we
At some point, you have to assume
yeah
it's intentional.
and in a way that was like really like I wasn't like I was like, wow, like this is brave. Like this is brave cinema. Like I congratulate you, Wachowskis. And
Yeah, good. That was safe. Thank you. So if you guys want to hear more conversation about this and other topics, especially when we're talking about how do we, know what we know, epistemology, what is real, what isn't real, what's in the Matrix, then keep listening to the Voyage podcast. And just to get our episodes out there, rate, give us a 5-star rating, give a positive review, share our podcast with others. And, since we're talking so much about knowledge, Jacob will even know when you give us that, positive review. He will know that it's real. It won't just be.
I see you when you're sleeping, and I know when you're awake, giving us positive ratings and subscribing.
Oh, we did not
Yeah.
rehearse that. That's for sure.
Emphasis on watching you while you sleep.
Yeah.
You gotta be careful what podcasts you involve yourself with.
It's just a collection of numbers and letters, right? It's just a code. Wake up, Jacob.
That's exactly it. Wake up. Very good, Mike. Very good.
Thanks for listening to Voyage Podcast. The Voyage Podcast is a production of Voyage Comics and Publishing, which seeks to create exceptional entertainment informed by Catholic values that inspire people to live a heroic life. Voyage Comics seeks to advance truth and beauty found in powerful stories. To learn more, visit voyagecomics.com. You can also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.